The silence of the night in Utana was broken only by the cautious footsteps of the Syrian army surrounding the city. The atmosphere was tense. The inhabitants slept soundly, unaware of the approaching danger. Yet in a modest home a man was resting peacefully. Elisha, the prophet of God, knew that an extraordinary event was about to occur. This moment was not simply a biblical passage, but the prelude to a miracle that would redefine the perception of divine power and spiritual vision. Elisha is a remarkable figure in the biblical narrative, a man walking between the mysteries of heaven and the challenges of earth. Chosen as Eli's successor, he inherited not only the prophetic mission, but also the responsibility of revealing God's heart to a nation in turmoil. His story is not about personal glory, but about a calling to be an instrument of transformation in times of crisis. His life teaches us that those who place their trust in God see beyond the visible circumstances. The Bible presents us with this dramatic scene in 2 Kings 6 verse 23, where the Syrian army prepares to capture Elisha. However, it was not a simple military siege. It was an encounter between the visible and the invisible, between human power and divine intervention. It is impossible not to be moved when imagining Elisha's unwavering faith in the face of such a situation. Criticism: how many times in our lives do we feel cornered with no way out? This story reminds us that there is always more than our eyes can see. What makes this story even more fascinating is the contrast between human fear and spiritual confidence. Elisha's servant who sent out the enemy army panicked, but Elisha calmly and confidently declared, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." 2 Kings 6 verse 16. This phrase resonates in our hearts, challenging us to trust in the unseen when the scene seems threatening. As we delve deeper into this story, we realize that it is speaking directly to us. We may not be surrounded by armies, but we face pressures, challenges, and fears that seem insurmountable. Modern life bombards us with problems that test our faith, but this story teaches us that instead of despairing, we can seek refuge in prayer and spiritual insight. Elysium shows us that the answer lies in our ability to look up and trust in the divine presence. This introduction to the power of prayer and spiritual insight prepares us to explore something even deeper: the historical context in which this story took place, Israel's political instability, the conflicts with Syria, and the role of a prophet in the midst of chaos. This is just the beginning of a journey that reveals how God is present in the more difficult crises. If this type of content interests you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and indicate in the comments where you are watching. And now, let's move on to the video. The period in which Elisha exercised his ministry was marked by profound changes and instability in the kingdom of Israel. The division of the kingdom that occurred after Solomon's death left political and spiritual wounds that lasted 4 generations. Israel in the north faced constant conflicts with Judah in the south, as well as internal tensions with neighboring nations. Internally, the king struggled to maintain control amid idolatry and corruption, moving away from the voices of God. In this context, the prophets became essential voices calling for justice and repentance. Among Israel's greatest enemies was Syria, ruled by kings like Ben-Hadad, who frequently invaded Israelite territory to conquer and plunder. This confrontation was not only a struggle for power but also reflected a spiritual battle between the gods of the nations and the God of Israel. Ben-Hadad sought to humiliate Israel to subdue it by force, while prophets like Elisha reminded the people that their true strength came from the Lord. In times of crisis, it is common to forget who really supports our victories. The role of the prophets went far beyond the announcement of the future. They were counselors, moral arbiters, and often confronters of kings. Elisha, for example, did not hesitate to denounce the sins of the leaders or to warn them of the consequences of their choice. He interceded for Israel before God while revealing divine strategies to protect the people. A clear example is the episode where Elisha, by divine revelation, revealed the planned Syrian military saving Israel from impending disaster. 2 Kings 69. His life illustrates how God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary purposes. The spiritual instability of the people of Israel is one reason why God raised up prophets like Elisha when the kingdom was under the influence of idolatrous practices. The prophets reminded the people that their covenant with God required faithfulness. This message is a powerful reminder for our times, when we are going through uncertain times. It is essential to return to the foundation of faith. Ephesians 6 verse 12 offers us a timeless perspective on these conflicts because we do not have to fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of this world of darkness. This truth resonates in the context of Israel, where the battles were not only physical, but also spiritual. Today, nothing has changed in the face of challenges that seem insurmountable. We are called to equip ourselves spiritually with faith, prayer, and the Word of God. This period in Israel also reveals God's patience and mercy. Despite the constant rebellions of the people, He did not abandon them. On the contrary, He sent men like Elisha to guide, protect, and restore. How many times in our lives have we experienced God's grace, even when we fail? This story teaches us that even in the midst of instability, we can count on divine faithfulness. By examining the historical and spiritual events that shaped this period, we discover that they are not just facts of the past. They reflect our own struggles, doubts, and choices. The story of Elysium inspires us to look beyond the immediate problems and seek God's guidance. Elisha was not just a prophet, but a living example of how God can use a person to transform a generation. His journey began humbly as a farmer until he placed his mantle upon him, symbolizing the divine calling. 1 Kings 19:19-21. From that moment on, Elisha left everything to follow the prophet. The prophet became his faithful disciple. He not only sought to learn from Elisha, but desired a deep communion with God. How many times in our lives are we called to leave something behind to follow a greater purpose? Elisha's request for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. 2 Kings 29 reveals his boldness and determination. This request was not motivated by ambition but by the awareness that the mission would be great and would require more than he could offer alone, and God answered his prayer, honoring his faith and humility. This teaches us that God delights in boldness. Faith. Elisha witnessed the rapture of Elijah, an extraordinary moment when the sky touched the earth of the Kings 21. This event marked the beginning of his ministry that would be filled with miracles and revelations. Among these remarkable acts are the purification of the UAE and Jericho in Kings 2:20 and 19-22, and the multiplication of the widow's oil. 2 Kings 4:1. If every miracle had a greater purpose, revealing God's care and restoring the faith of the people. This reminds us that just as in the time of Elisha, God still acts on our behalf in unexpected ways. The resurrection of the son of Tamath. 2 Kings 41-37 is perhaps one of the most moving miracles performed by Elisha. He not only prayed, but acted in faith, showing that true trust in God requires perseverance. How many times do we give up because we don't see immediate results? Elisha teaches us that when we seek God, we must persist because He always has a plan, even when we don't see it. To fully understand beyond the miracles, Elisha played a crucial role as a counselor and protector of Israel. He revealed the plans of enemies and guided kings, often saving the people from impending disaster. 2 Kings 6 verses 9-12. His life illustrates how a willing heart can become a channel for divine intervention. It encourages us to be attentive to the voice of God and ready to be used by Him, whatever the circumstances. Elisha also possessed impressive spiritual authority, not only confronting kings and rulers, but also correcting his own people when necessary. A notable example is his rebuke of the young men who mocked him, which resulted in a demonstration of the power of God. Kings 3-25. This episode, although difficult to understand at first glance, teaches us respect for sacred things. Today, we are called to live in such a way that we honor God both by our words and by our actions. Elisha's life was a constant demonstration of God's power and presence in an unstable world. His legacy inspires us to live with faith and intention, recognizing that, like him, we are called to be instruments of God's transformation. The city, located on a strategic hill, carries a rich and significant history in the biblical narrative. Its elevated position made it a crucial natural vantage point in times of war, but also a place where significant events unfolded. In Genesis 37, Joseph was especially noted for being sold by his brothers to Ishmaelite merchants and embarking on a path of suffering and redemption that would change the destiny of Israel. It is no wonder that this same place would become the scene of another divine act centuries later involving Elisha and the Syrian army. The geography of Dothan reminds us how God often chooses simple places to accomplish extraordinary things. Surrounded by plains and mountains, the city offered both refuge and exposure. This contrast reflects the spiritual tension present in many biblical events. Just as Joseph was betrayed in a seemingly safe place, Elisha was surrounded by enemies, revealing God's will and presence in the midst of danger. This invites us to see difficult moments in our lives as opportunities for divine action. The connection between Joseph and Elisha in Dan is not simply geographical, but spiritual. Both faced situations in which they seemed isolated and hopeless, but were sustained by divine intervention. The story of Joseph being sold into slavery culminates in his rise to second place in Egypt, showing that God transforms adverse circumstances into blessings. Elsewhere, Elisha's siege of Dothan reveals the heavenly hosts that surrounded him, reinforcing the idea that God never abandons those who place their trust in him, beyond its historical significance. Dothan symbolizes the repetition of spiritual motifs in the Bible. Places where great events occur often become the setting for new miracles. This teaches us that God acts in familiar contexts to remind us of his faithfulness. Just as Mount Sinai was the meeting point between God and Moses, it became a place where heaven and earth met again. This invites us to identify the Dothans in our lives, these places where God has acted, and where he can still act. The events of Dothan also underscore the importance of remaining spiritually vigilant. The hill, as an observation point, allowed us to watch out for the enemy, but also represented the need to be alert to spiritual realities. The Apostle Paul exhorts us, in the 1 Corinthians 16:13, to be vigilant, stand firm in the faith, act with courage, be strong, just as the residents of Dothan were. Instructed to remain vigilant against physical threats, we are called to be alert to spiritual challenges. It is fascinating to see how the biblical story reveals that even the simplest places can become eternal monuments of God's power. It was not a grand city, but it became a symbol of divine intervention in times of crisis. It encourages us to look at the ordinary places of our lives with new eyes, seeking where God may be acting in an invisible but powerful way. Dean's narration prepares us to understand the strategy of the Syrian king and God's intervention. The Syrian king Ben-Hadad was frustrated by his carefully crafted military strategies and was repeatedly deceived even before he was executed. Convinced that there was a traitor in his ranks, he confronted his advisors. The answer was surprising, not for the king, but there is a prophet in Israel who reports to the king of Israel even the words that you speak in your bedroom. 2 Kings 61. This statement not only revealed the power of God, but also increased the tension between Syria and Israel. How could anyone fight against a God who knew even the most secret thoughts? Ben-Hadad's strategy was to capture Elysium and silence the source of divine revelation. In his desperation, he sent an entire army to surround the very place where Elysium was located. It is fascinating to see how human strength often tries to overcome divine wisdom, as if numbers and power were enough to overcome the will of God. This situation teaches us that no matter how elaborate human plans may be, they will always remain subject to the sovereign design of the Lord. Ben-Hadad's counselors, while recognizing the power of Elysium, failed to understand that it was not the prophet who revealed his plan, but God himself. This reflects a recurring pattern in the Bible. Israel's enemies often underestimate the power of the living God, just as Pharaoh was confronted with the mighty hand of God in Egypt. Ben-Hadad now found himself before a God who knew every move before it was made. This truth invites us to place our trust in God when we are faced with situations that seem beyond our control. The decision to send an entire army against a single man reveals not only the Syrian king's fear, but also his ignorance of divine power. How many times in our own lives have we tried to combat spiritual challenges with human resources? Ephesians 6 verse 12 reminds us that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. The siege of Dothan symbolizes the struggle between the visible and the invisible, a central theme in the story of Elysium. Even surrounded by an enemy army, Elisha showed neither fear nor despair. His calm contrasts sharply with the attitude of his servant, who, upon seeing the situation, exclaimed, "Oh, my lord, what shall we do?" 2 Kings 6:15. Elisha's confidence came from his awareness of God's presence and the spiritual vision he possessed. This compels us to seek a similar faith, a faith that does not waver in the face of adversity, but is based on the certainty that God is in control of all things. The story of 2 Kings 6 gives us a powerful lesson. God not only observes situations, but actively intervenes on behalf of his people. The Syrian king's plan seemed infallible, but it was limited by human perspective. Elisha, on the other hand, saw beyond what the natural eyes could perceive. His trust in God teaches us that true victory is not in our strategies, but in our ability to depend on the Lord in all things. Darkness enveloped the city of Dothan as the Syrian army moved silently to surround it under the cover of night. The soldiers, confident in their numerical superiority, positioned themselves strategically around the city. It was a seemingly foolproof maneuver. But in the midst of all this tension, in a simple house, Elisha remained at peace. This scene teaches us that even when everything seems to overwhelm us, trust in God can bring calm in the midst of chaos. At dawn, Elisha's servant went out and saw the Syrian army surrounding the city. He ran back and exclaimed, "Oh, my lord, what shall we do?" In 2 Kings 6 verse 15, this very human reaction reflects our own response to situations that seem hopeless. Fear and despair are natural, but it is in these moments that faith must come into play. Elisha, with impressive serenity, responded with a phrase that has reasoned through the ages: "Do not fear, for those who are with us are greater than those who are with them." 2 Kings 6 verse 16. How often do we forget this truth when we face our own challenges? Trust in God of Elysium did not come from a denial of reality, but from a broader and deeper vision. He knew that God was present and that the heavenly host had already taken position. This reminds us that there is a spiritual dimension, that is, constantly working in our favor, even when we do not realize it. Many times we face crises with a limited vision, forgetting that God sees the whole picture. The question is, how can we learn to trust in the unseen? At that moment, Elisha not only declared the presence of God, but also prayed that his servant's eyes would be opened. "Lord, open his eyes. I pray that he may see." Kings 6:17. And when he opened his eyes, the servant saw the mountain full of horses and chariots of fire surrounding Elysium. Imagine the impact of this vision. Suddenly, what seemed like an impossible situation became a demonstration of divine supremacy. This teaches us that instead of asking God to take away our problems, we should ask Him to give us spiritual vision to see His provision in the midst of difficulties. The tranquility of Elysium in the midst of the siege invites us to reflect on our own response to life's challenges. While the world pushes us to respond with anxiety and fear, God calls us to trust in Him for His presence and power. This story challenges us to cultivate a faith that not only acknowledges the existence of God, but also rests in His sovereignty. How can we apply this in our daily lives? Through constant prayer and meditation on His promises. The contrast between the Syrian army and the chariots of fire and grasping on one side is the human power limited by its weapons and its strategies, on the other the unlimited and invincible heavenly power. This teaches us that the battles of life are not won by strength or numbers, but by the presence of God by our side. The security that Elisha felt was the fruit of a life connected to God, a lesson that we can all apply. When was the last time we sought this connection? In the midst of our struggles, the Elysium prayer is an example of how faith can transform a person's perception, bringing hope in the midst of darkness. It makes us think about what we fail to see in our lives due to lack of faith and prayer. The concept of spiritual vision challenges us to go beyond the obvious. Often we are so focused on the problems that we forget to look at the solutions that God has already placed around us. The story, the servant's message, teaches us that even when we don't see God working in times of crisis, our first response should be to seek God's guidance, just as Elisha did. We do this through prayer and reading the Word, where we find promises that renew our confidence. This passage also reminds us that spiritual reality is much greater than we can imagine. In Ephesians 11 verse 18, Paul prays that the eyes of his heart may be enlightened, so that you may know the hope of your calling. This prayer echoes what Elisha did for his servant, showing that spiritual vision is essential to understanding God's plans. How often we face challenges that seem insurmountable, but with the right vision, they become opportunities to experience divine power. The vision of the heavenly host was not only a comfort to the servant, but also an affirmation of God's sovereign power. Each horse and chariot of fire represented the divine presence, reminding us that God is infinitely greater than any force that opposes us. It challenges us to align our vision with God's, allowing His perspective to transform the way we face our problems. How can we do this? Start by dedicating a moment each day to RP, asking God to show you the solutions that you have not yet realized. Elisha's prayer also teaches us intercession. He prayed not only for himself, but also for his servant. This gesture reminds us of the importance of praying for one another, especially in times of difficulty. Have you ever prayed for God to open the spiritual eyes of someone close to you? This type of prayer can change lives, as it did with the servant of Elisha, who went from fear to confidence in a few moments with his spiritual eyes open. The servant of Elisha understood that the fight was not just about the Syrian army, but a battle where divine power had already prevailed. The story takes us to a crucial point: the impact of supernatural blindness on enemy soldiers. This next step will show how God not only protects, but also transforms seemingly impossible situations into complete victory. As the Syrian army advanced to capture the prophet, Elisha's response was as unexpected as it was powerful. Elisha prayed again, this time asking God to strike this army with blindness. I pray 2 Kings 6:18. In an instant, the soldiers, once so confident in their numerical superiority, lost their sight. This blindness was not simply physical, it was a divine intervention that left them disoriented and unable to carry out their plans. This reminds us that in any confrontation, the power of God far surpasses human strength. This miracle presents a fascinating contrast. While the Syrian soldiers were struck by physical blindness, the servant of Elisha had just seen his spiritual eyes opened. It is as if God were illustrating two profound truths: the importance of seeing with the eyes of faith and the limitations of purely carnal vision. The soldiers' blindness was not an act of revenge or punishment, but an act with a divine purpose. Rather than destroying them, God used this condition to create an opportunity for transformation. This teaches us that God often intervenes in unexpected ways to lead us to a place of reflection and change. Imagine the Syrian soldiers, disoriented and dependent on Elisha, who were captured. This role reversal shows that God can turn any situation to our advantage. This episode also finds a parallel with the story of Sodom in Genesis 19:11. The men who threatened the water were blinded in both cases. Physical blindness symbolizes the inability to see spiritual truth. It leads us to think about how we use our own vision. Do we see only what is in front of us, or do we seek divine guidance to understand what is truly important? Elisha's action in guiding the blind soldiers is an example of spiritual leadership. Not only had he spared them, but he also took on the role of guide, leading them to a destination he could never have reached alone. This challenges us to be guides in our own spheres of influence, helping those who are lost or blind, not with condemnation, but with compassion. Who can you help? Makes us see more clearly today. The blindness of the soldiers teaches us about God's sovereignty in the midst of our conflicts, no matter how powerful the opposition seems. Is in absolute control. This story reminds us that instead of reacting with fear or anger, we can trust that God is working behind the scenes, even in situations that seem impossible to solve. How to apply this? When facing challenges, we must pray for wisdom and direction, having faith that God has a solution beyond what we can imagine. Imagine the scene: an entire army now blind, guided by the one they had come to capture. Elisha, with a calm and confident authority, led the Syrian soldiers on an unlikely journey to Samaria, the capital of Israel. In 2 Kings 61, he told them, "This is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you seek." What seems to be a paradox, the prophet leading his enemies reveals a profound teaching about mercy and spiritual leadership. The march to Samaria is much more than a physical displacement. It is a transformation in progress. The soldiers, deprived of their vision and their initial objective, now depended entirely on Elisha. This act reminds us that God not only protects his people, but also uses situations of vulnerability to teach us lessons of humility and dependence. Just as the soldiers trusted his destiny for Elisha, we are called to trust God when we cannot see the way forward. When they reached Samaria, the situation changed dramatically. Elisha prayed again, and the eyes of the soldiers were opened to civilian kings. They found themselves in the heart of vulnerable and exposed enemy territory. This turn of events illustrates God's ability to turn seemingly hopeless situations into opportunities to reveal his grace. How many times in our lives have we found ourselves in Samaria unexpected, where divine intervention gave us a new perspective? When the disarmed and disoriented Syrian army was driven into the center of Samaria, the king of Israel saw an opportunity for revenge, but Elisha once again responded in a surprising way. Instead of ordering the destruction of his enemies, he asked the king to prepare a feast for them, bread and water, so they could eat and drink and return to their lord. King 622. This unexpected decision reveals a profound spiritual lesson. Mercy is more powerful than retribution. The banquet that was prepared, and it was not just a meal. It was a practical demonstration of God's love. Instead of being humiliated as prisoners of war, the Syrian soldiers were treated with dignity and respect. This act of unconditional generosity reflects the words of Jesus, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you." Luke 6:27. The kindness shown to the soldiers leads us to think about how we respond to offenses in our own lives. During the banquet, the Syrian soldiers experienced something they probably never imagined: the grace of God through his servants. This gesture reminds us that even in the face of our enemies, we are called to act in accordance with the values of the kingdom of God. Imagine the impact of this banquet on these men, accustomed to the brutality of war. The act of offering bread and water to the enemies invites us to reflect on how we can show mercy in everyday situations. Elisha's decision to feed the soldiers was more than his act of kindness, was a strategic and spiritual choice. Rather than inciting further hostility, he chose to disarm hatred with love. This approach not only ended the immediate conflict, but also paved the way for lasting peace between Israel and Syria. 2 Kings 6 verse 23. How often do we underestimate the transformative power of a simple act of kindness? Proverbs 25 verses 21 to 22 reminds us that if your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. If he is thirsty, give him a drink of water. Elisha put this truth into practice, showing that mercy can disarm even the hardest hearts, which leads us to question how we can apply this lesson in our lives. Perhaps by forgiving someone who has hurt us, or surprising a difficult colleague with an act of kindness. The banquet of mercy is also a reflection of God's own character. In our condition as sinners, we were enemies of God, but he invited us to the banquet of grace through Jesus Christ. Just as the Syrian soldiers were surprised by Israel's generosity, we are called to surprise the world by reflecting God's unconditional love in our actions. This not only transforms relationships, but also points to divine reconciliation. The impact of this banquet transcended the moment, setting a precedent of peace and mercy. This story invites us to reflect on how our choices can have a lasting impact on our communities. The next step in this narrative will show us how this event transformed relations between Israel and Syria, leaving eternal lessons for each of us. The event in Samaria, where enemies were transformed into honored guests, left deep marks in Israel as in Syria. The act of mercy commanded by Elisha did not merely save lives, but also set a precedent that transcended the battlefield. The Bible records that after the banquet, the Syrian soldiers returned to their kings, and the Syrian troops no longer entered the territory of Israel. 2 Kings 6 verse 23. This peace, although temporary, testifies to the power of forgiveness and reconciliation in a world of conflict. For Israel, this event reaffirmed the spiritual authority of Elysium and the reality of God's power at work in a time of political and spiritual instability. The prophet demonstrated that true strength lies not in payment, but in obedience to the Lord. It also brought a sense of unity and hope to the people who saw that God was not only protecting them, but also acting in unexpected ways to ensure their safety. Sometimes we underestimate ourselves how God can intervene in our own lives to bring peaceful solutions amid the turmoil in Syria. The impact was so significant that the soldiers who experienced Israel's mercy returned home not as conquerors, but as men who had been spared by the kindness of their enemies. It is likely that this testimony is based on the Ben-Hadad court questioning the conceptions of power and strength based solely on violence. The experience of these soldiers reminds us that even the hardest hearts can be touched by acts of compassion. How does this apply to our context? Perhaps an unexpected act of kindness can be the first step in calming tensions in our own relationships. The spiritual impact of this event is immense. Rather than giving in to the usual cycle of hostility and retaliation, Israel responded with grace. This reminds us of Jesus' instruction, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Matthew 59. Elisha demonstrated that true victory is not just about protecting ourselves, but also about transforming how we can be peacemakers in our own contexts, perhaps through an act of forgiveness or choosing not to return evil for evil. The decision of Elisha and the king of Israel was also a practice of leadership. They showed that power does not lie in crushing the enemy, but in offering an alternative that promotes peace. This principle is applicable in all spheres of leadership, whether families, communities, or even in professional settings. Leaders who choose mercy over vengeance leave a lasting impact on what kind of leader we want to be in our lives. The banquet of mercy and its repercussions also point to the very nature of the gospel. God, in His infinite goodness, chose to save us and reconcile us to Himself, even when we were His enemies. Just as the Syrian soldiers experienced the goodness of Israel, so we are called to experience and share the grace of God. With others, this story invites us to reflect. We live as reflections of this mercy in our own communities. The story of Elisha and the siege of Dothan transcends its historical and cultural context, bringing timeless lessons to our lives. One of the greatest lessons is the importance of spiritual vision in times of crisis. When Elisha's servant panicked upon seeing the enemy army, Elisha prayed for God to open his eyes. 2 Kings 617. This prayer reminds us that when faced with life's challenges, we must seek a divine perspective. What in your life seems like a siege? Maybe it's time to ask God to show you what's happening beyond what your natural eyes can see. Another powerful lesson is the impact of prayer as a tool for transformation. Elisha prayed not only to open his servants' eyes, but also to blind them. Syrian. In both cases, prayer was the catalyst for extraordinary change. This challenges us to think about the frequency and intensity of our prayers. We pray with faith, believing that God can intervene in our situations. The Bible teaches us that the prayer of the righteous has great effectiveness. James 5:16. Why not start taking a few minutes out of your day to pray specifically for situations that seem impossible? Elisha's response to the enemy soldiers also provides a crucial lesson about the power of responding to hatred with love. Instead of ordering their destruction, he fed them and sent them away in peace. This action is not only a demonstration of mercy, but also a reflection of the heart of God. How can we apply this in our daily lives? Perhaps by forgiving someone who has wronged us or responding to hostility with an act of kindness. Proverbs 25 verses 21 to 22 reminds us that if your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he is thirsty, give him water to drink. The story also teaches us about leadership and discernment. Elisha showed that a true leader does not act on impulse or emotion, but seeks God's guidance before making decisions. Whether in our families, our work, or our communities, we are called to lead wisely, prioritizing reconciliation and peace. It challenges us to think about whether we are leading in ways that honor God and inspire others to follow His way. Furthermore, the story challenges us to live with confidence in God's presence and protection. Just as Elisha knew that there are more people who are with us than those who are with them, 2 Kings 6 verse 16. We are called to live with the assurance that God is with us, even when circumstances seem contrary. This confidence gives us the courage to face challenges, knowing that we are not alone. Finally, this story reminds us that our actions have the power to transform lives and create a lasting impact. The Feast of Mercy not only ended the immediate conflict, but also left a mark of reconciliation between Israel and Syria. This invites us to reflect on what kind of impact we leave on the people around us. We live in ways that reflect God's will. Love and grace. These lessons prepare us to reflect on how the story of Elysium transcends its context, offering us a call to spiritual transformation and practical application in our lives. The outcome of this story leads us to consider how God continues to call us to see beyond the visible and live according to his eternal designs. And now, after delving into this impressive story, the question that remains is how you face the sieges of your life. Did you see only the challenges, or did you seek to see beyond them, trusting that God is by your side? Work even when all seems lost. Elysium teaches us that true power is not in the circumstances, but in who is on our side. Are you ready to open your spiritual eyes and see what God has done for you? Maybe today is the day you can change the way you approach your challenges. Why don't start by asking God to open your eyes like Elisha did for his servant, and more how you can show mercy and grace to those around you, even to those who confront you as enemies. Think about the impact you can have on someone's life by simply choosing to act with kindness instead of with revenge. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Reflect on what you have learned and put it into practice. After all, each of us faces battles, but with a correct spiritual vision, we can discover that those who are with us are more than those who are with them. 2 Kings 6:16. Are you ready to live this truth in your life? If you want to continue learning more about stories like this and applying its teachings in your daily life, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any content that can transform your way of seeing life and your faith soon. And may God open your eyes to the great things he does for you. Blessing, and may God be with you. Did you like the video? Then subscribe to the channel and leave a like to always be receiving notifications.